This morning we're going to talk about aligning our individual will as an ego with God's will. It's a very important subject, and one that one might even say is the essence of the whole of this spiritual adventure. Yogananda ji said that the human will, our individual willpower, is guided by whims and by past habits. So, what is willpower, first off? Yogananda gave a very simple, very clear explanation of it. He said that will is a desire plus the energy behind that desire directed toward a goal. And so whatever goals you have, whatever energy you put out to achieve those goals, that's your direction of willpower. Now, what Yogananda was meaning here is that the goals that we have are largely determined by our past karma and by the whims that come in. And these can be short-term goals. They might be the goal of you're hungry, you want to have lunch, you hope that we won't talk too long so that we can go and have some prasad. Or they might be longer-term goals. They might be that you want to succeed at your work. You want to be creative. You want to find an ideal partner. They could be long-term goals, but whatever those goals are, if they come only from your past experience, only from the whims that you have, only from, one might say, your past samskars, then they will essentially keep you locked in to the circle in which you have already enclosed yourself. So how do we get out of this self-enclosure of our individual, one might say, level of consciousness? And because of that level of consciousness, the goals that we have, the desires that we have, how do we get out of that? Well, it begins by offering ourselves, by consciously offering our own willpower, our own individual goals at the feet of the divine. Swami Kriyananda was a wonderful example of this. He had many, many accomplishments. Those who know him know of them. He wrote 150 books. He wrote 400 pieces of music. He gave thousands of lectures. But more importantly, he started the whole energy, the whole work that has now become Ananda, that is reaching tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world with these great teachings. And so you'd think that all of that must have been done because he had a desire to do it. He said that he had no desire to do anything except to be in tune with his master. He said, when I'm done, when I leave the body, I don't want to be known for any of those outer accomplishments. I want to be known by one thing. He was a good disciple. Being a disciple of Master was Swami's whole goal. And so he offered everything that he did, every project, every piece of music, everything, he offered that into the divine light, Master's guidance. And by doing that, he arrived at the end of his life at the point where he said, I can no longer tell where Kriyananda leaves off and Yogananda begins. Because everything that he did, one time he said, I have long offered all of my energy, all of my actions, all of my words to Master for his guidance. He said, I realized that wasn't enough. I have to offer everything, every little passing desire I have to lay at Master's feet. Every act that I'm trying to accomplish, let me lay at Master's feet. And as we do that, as he guided us to do that, we eventually more and more align our whims and our egoic-driven willpower with the desire or the goal of the divine. And the divine goal for us is always to draw us back into union. That's God's drama, is that He has created us. He's given us the delusion of being separate from Him, her. But He wants, in the midst of that delusion, for us to make the individual choice of saying, all I want, my whole goal, my whole will, is simply to merge back with you. And so, one time we were with Swamiji and we had watched a very, very fine film. It was a documentary on the life of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And it had many, many interviews with her and talked about her childhood growing up and her becoming a nun and in the Catholic Church. And then about her hearing the voice of Jesus telling her to serve the poorest of the poor, and her coming to Calcutta and doing that work, which has inspired people all over the planet with that beautiful service of hers. And at the end of that movie, a small group of us had gone with Swami Kriyananda, and he said there was one statement in that movie that was by far the most important statement. And he said, I would suspect that hardly anyone attending that movie understood the importance of that. And he said it was this. An interviewer, the interviewer in the film, asked her, why did you begin to do this work? And she said, it was because Jesus told me to do it. Her guru was Jesus. But that alignment of her individual will with the will of God, as spoken through her guru, was the directing force of her life. And because of that, the work that she did was not only a success, but it had the ability to inspire hundreds of millions of people, billions of people all around the world. But it was that alignment of her individual will with the will of God. So how do we as people begin that process? Because not all of us are going to hear the word of God speaking in our ear. Not all of us are going to have a guru like Paramahansa Yogananda, which was Swamiji's guru, and have that guidance of him and connection with him. So we're left, to a certain extent, to our own devices to understand how we can align our will to the will of God. Well, the first step in that is to simply ask. Because if we don't ask, we're going to act, we're going to have goals, we're going to have desires, we're going to act. But if we don't ask God for His guidance, then whatever we do will be guided by our own ego, which is through the drama of God, which is separate, has at least the delusion of separation. And so those individual desires, the first step is simply to ask God. Master said that his most important prayer, this is a very important statement of his most important prayer was, I will reason, I will act, but guide thou my reason, will, and activity to the right thing, to the right path in everything. And so there's that balance between, we can't just sit there and wait for God to speak in our voice in the form of a guru and tell us what to do. If we did that, nothing would happen. In fact, Swami Kriyananda told an amusing story. He said that he was contemplating the idea that God does everything through us. And so we don't act at all, that really every action is done by God. And he decided, well, I want to put this to a test, like a spiritual scientist. If God does everything, then he's going to act through me. And so in the middle of a talk that he was giving, he simply stopped, and he was waiting for God to speak through him. And he said that he stopped for 2 minutes, nothing at all, in the midst of a big satsang. He said he could see people were sweating, thinking that he had somehow frozen and couldn't, his mind had gone blank. But he said, I was just sitting there, standing there, happily waiting for God to speak through me. And then after a couple of minutes, I realized that he wasn't going to speak through me like I was an automaton, that I had to go ahead and speak again. So he said, that was a nice experiment, gave me some understanding. So we can't just be passive and expect God to speak through us. It's like a dance. You know, in the West, there are dances. One of the most famous is the waltz. Indian dance is different. It's much more beautiful and spiritual, and has its purpose to portray beautiful things. But waltzing for many people is fun. But generally, the man leads and the woman follows. And if they both try to lead, it's just chaos. And so one has to lead and one has to follow. The one who follows has to accept the fact that I'm following the lead. Well, it's like that. If we're going to be aligning ourselves to the will of God, we have to let God take the lead in our lives. And we have to be willing to follow. The great writer C.S. Lewis had a very amusing statement one time. He said, many, many people want to serve God. The majority of them want to serve in an advisory capacity. So we don't want to follow, we want to advise, we want to take the lead and have God follow us. Isn't that true? And so many people, why did you do this, God? I was expecting you to give me this new job and you didn't do it. One time, the leader of the work in Mexico was a man named Senor Cuaron. And one time he wrote Master, sent him a telegram. He had been out of work for some time, and sent Master a telegram, I have been offered this wonderful new position. And he was just kind of out of courtesy informing Master that he'd been offered this position. And immediately came back a telegram from Yogananda saying, do not take that job, under no conditions take that job. And so Senor Cuaron was enough of a disciple so that he followed his guru's wish. And it turned out that the company that was offering him the job was corrupt. And they were under investigation. And they were hiring a person to be put into the position to blame everything on. And the person who did take that job ended up having to go to prison. And so the follow-up of that story is someone asked Senor Cuaron, well, did Master get you another job? And Senor Cuaron said no. See, when we follow the divine, he doesn't always accede to our wishes. And we have to be ready for that. And the reason that Senior Quaron didn't get another job is that he had sufficient income and he had now given his life more to the spiritual pursuits. And another job would simply have embroiled his mind and his time and his energy. So God may seem to make things inconvenient for us, but know this, it is always done out of love and always done for our benefit. So we have to offer our actions, our desires, our goals, our will to be guided by God. And if we don't hear His voice speaking to Him, then what should we do? Well, if you don't hear His voice, imagine what He would say. That brings you to, generally speaking, the highest thing that you can think of. One time Swami gave a talk and an atheist came up and said, "I don't believe in God. What do you have to offer me?" And Swami said, "Well then, follow whatever you can imagine to be the highest thing to do." And the atheist said, "I can live with that." And so if you don't hear the voice of God, try to imagine that He's speaking to you in this situation and asking Him, what is your will in this? What is the highest thing in this? And if you do follow that, gradually your intuition will develop and you will be able to feel more and more that your life is guided minute by minute and moment by moment by the will of the divine. And when that happens, then all of your actions will be in alignment with the divine will. They may not be all that pleasing to you, honestly. Sometimes you may have to do things, you may have to give selflessly when you don't feel like giving selflessly. If you're going to serve the divine, it begins by serving other people. And so the divine may ask you to do things that are inconvenient to you and inconvenient to your old habit patterns. But if you do this, if you literally, honestly, sincerely ask for divine guidance in whatever you do, especially important things, then you will receive divine guidance, and that will always, always turn out to be the best for your eventual spiritual benefit.
Sometimes life is very confusing, isn't it? It's, when you think about it from a certain perspective, it's just choices. I have to decide what to do in this circumstance. I have to decide what to do in that circumstance. And when Jyotish said, sometimes we're left to our own devices, he wasn't meaning our cell phones. He was meaning our own ability to sort things out. So really, it's when we begin to put our lives in God's hands, it is such a reassuring thing, because Master said it so beautifully. He said, our own human will is guided by our limited perspective based on our whims and our desires. But God's will perceives the truth on every level of reality. And so you can think of it this way. We all have our little GPS devices on our phones, don't we? And if you want to get from one place to another, to find the right course to take, you need to get the big, this is declining here. You need to get the big picture. And if we're trying to get somewhere and we blow up that point we're trying to get to, we don't see the route to get there, do we? And so we have to look at the biggest, and when we blow up our goal, what does that mean? It means we're going only by our own desires and our own egoic perspective. But when we can think of...
We'll keep declining, I think.
Okay. Good, thank you. This is a little pun now that we're going to share. Instead of thinking of GPS, meaning global positioning system. Think of God's personal signals to you. God's personal signals. And that's what we have to look at. We have to say, okay, I don't know how to get from point A to point B. I'm really confused about this. How do I get there? I just see one route, and maybe it's not the best way. And honestly, usually it's not, if it's just what we want. Please, God, let this happen, let this happen. We pray so hard. But how often have your prayers not been answered? And why is that? Because what we're praying for is not for our highest good. Just like in Autobiography of a Yogi, Sri Yukteswar speaks of when he was a young boy and he became very attracted to this ugly dog that belonged to a neighbor. Well, every story in Autobiography of a Yogi is with a purpose. We might think, well, I'm not attracted to an ugly dog that belongs to a neighbor. But how often are we attracted to things that aren't in our highest good? And we can pray and pray. And if we're lucky, they don't come to pass if they're not for our highest good. We can force it, we can force them to happen, and then we have it and we realize, oh, this just blew up in my face. It wasn't really what was supposed to happen on the highest level. And so it's an interesting balance, isn't it? Because surrendering to God's will is by no means a passive thing. It takes all of our strength. We were just watching, and you've probably all seen them because it's an old video series of the Ramayana. Came out long ago, but beautifully done. We were watching some episodes of it, and watching the episode, which is of course pivotal in the Ramayana, where Ram's father asks him to leave the kingdom. He doesn't want to leave. No one wants him to leave. But the Dharma is, and God's will is coming through the father in this case, that he must leave. And you see this beautiful portrayal of everyone, his brother Bharat, his brother Lakshman, Sita, the mothers, no, they're begging him to stay. And Ram himself knows that if he stays, the kingdom will be enriched. But it wasn't God's will. There was a bigger picture. He had to demonstrate the Dharma of total surrender to God's will. And that took the strength of everyone. And it's so beautiful to see that balance of surrender and commitment, determination to do God's will, however inconvenient it may be. It's rarely does God say, okay, here's the easy path to moksha. There is no easy path to moksha. There is only an ascent up the mountain to higher consciousness. But if we accept that, it's not a burden. It's a joyful self-offering. It's a joyful saying, I don't want to just be guided by my own desires. I want to be guided by the highest possible purpose in life. And the more we do that, the more we see how everything works out beautifully in the long run. Maybe not in the short run, but God's time is not our time. God's time is a long cycles, lifetimes. We're also reading Mahabharata, and what I love about it is showing this happened because 4 lifetimes ago that happened. And we just think, why is this happening in my life? Why? What did I do? Look at the bigger picture. We can't see it, but God can see it. Sometimes you see very good people having one difficulty after another difficulty. And once Swami Kriyananda went through a very difficult period of his life where he was severed from the organization he had been serving, and rather cruelly. And it was a very difficult time for him. And he went to see the great woman saint Ananda Ma, and all she said to him was, Guru's grace, Guru Kripa, Guru Kripa, Guru's grace. And in his heart he thought, how can this be Guru's grace? I feel like I've been cast out of my Guru's love. But he hadn't been. He had another work to do. And that work was Ananda. And to bring Master's teachings, bringing East and West together, sending, next year will be the 20th anniversary, the 100th anniversary, 2020, 100th anniversary of Yogananda coming to the West to start a world mission, to show that East and West can come together. You know, when I was a young girl in high school, we had a reading assignment, and it was to read the book Passage to India by E.M. Forster. I was not on the spiritual path, and it's the story of how the East and the West can never really understand each other. And when I finished that book, I was about 16 or 17 at the time. I didn't understand why, but I just laid on my bed and I cried for an hour. Why can't that have to be? Why does East and West have to be separated? We have so much to learn from each other. We have so much to share together. It's so rich, and it's part of the reason Jyotish and I just love being in India. I feel like every day that I'm here, I learn something about a beautiful, rich, deep culture and tradition. And so at that point, I thought, I didn't know why, but I felt this deep sadness in my heart of the separation. And then a few years later, I read Autobiography of a Yogi, and there Master talked about part of his mission was to bring East and West together. Well, if Swami Kriyananda had not had that difficult period, he would not have created an organization in the West in which we could be trained and then come and share the balance of these traditions, so of these truths that are at the heart of all people that Yogananda brought. And so things that look like the worst thing in your life, if we wait and don't pass judgment on them, just say, Lord, you know what you're doing. Let me see the final chapter of this book before I declare it bad or good. And the books that God writes always end with a beautiful ending. They always end with greater peace, with greater joy, with greater understanding, with greater inner freedom. So we must just patiently find that true strength to say, God, if this is what you want me to do, I will do it. No matter if it goes against my inclinations, my desires, anything. And when we begin living that way, we become like little children again. When another time Swamiji went to visit Ananda Ma with some of his Guru Bhais, the fellow disciples of the Master, and Ma looked at this group of disciples of Master, and she said, they are so soft. That's how she described them, so soft, because there wasn't any ego saying, I am a great yogi, I am meditating all these long hours, I am doing this. They were just surrendered to the will of God. And so this beautiful balance of strength and softness. Sri Yukteswar said, we should be strong as iron where principles are concerned, but soft as the lily where kindness is concerned, where offering of the heart is concerned. So let us learn from these thoughts that we're sharing this morning. Don't be afraid to give up what you think is right for what you know God thinks is right. It will always turn out better in the end. And the more we forge that deep sense of trust and devotion for God, the more He can take charge of your life, the more He can mold the events and circumstances, and the more your GPS, God's personal signals, it becomes stronger and stronger until finally you don't even need to look anymore. You just walk in the way where He leads you, and you find great joy and great peace.